Thanks, Nick, and good evening. It's really my honor to introduce our speaker today, Sylvia Federici. The length of my introduction is inversely proportional to the esteem in which I hold her. Sylvia Federici is Professor Emerita of New College at Hofstra University. Born in Italy, Federici participated in the generative Italian feminist movements of the 1960s, challenging the autonomous Marxist notion of the social factory for its neglect of the actual center of capitalist reproduction, the household, point zero, unpaid labor. Over the course of the following decades, Federici developed a body of work that continually argued for positing the divide between waged and unwaged work instituted under capitalism at the center of an anti-capitalist and emancipatory politics. Her career took her to the US in the late 1960s to pursue an MA and PhD at SUNY Buffalo, then a center of radical philosophy. She went on to teach at Hofstra and the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria. Federici co-founded the International Feminist Collective and related wages for housework campaigns in the 1970s, the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa in the 1980s, and she was involved in the Midnight Notes Collective and its publications in the 2000s. Federici has numerous writings, but I'll point out two of the books that I think in English have reached a very large audience: Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, and Revolution, the collection of essays, Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, which have become touchstones for students of feminist political economy.
Also pronounce this one.
Oh, yes. And just out from Autonomy, correct, is a collection of essays from the Wages for Housework movement of the 70s, from the archives, co-edited by,
Arlen Austin.
Yeah, Arlen Austin with Sylvia Federici. So, do I get to keep this then? So, without further ado then, please join me in welcoming Sylvia Federici to deliver the 2018 Antipode Lecture.
Good evening, and thank you for coming to this event, and thank you to all the organizers, to Wiley and to Miriam Wallner and to the Antipode Collective, first of all. My topic tonight is the struggle the women are making over the terrain of social reproduction and the extent to which these struggles are sowing the seeds of a new society, a society governed by a principle different than the logic of capitalism. But before I speak of that, I'd like to say a few words about the concept of reproduction, social reproduction, which I understand is becoming popular also among geographers. The concept of reproduction really originates in the natural sciences in the 18th century and was then very soon picked up by the physiocrats. And we know from Marx that the physiocrats were the first economists who recognized the existence of a society, recognized the existence of a system governed by a unitary logic, and they used the notion of reproduction to describe the mechanism by which this system will reproduce itself. This was the meaning that Marx gave to the notion of social reproduction. That's how he used it. And he used social reproduction to describe all the activities that contribute to the reproduction of the capitalist system. And he distinguished social reproduction from simple reproduction, which described in Marx the reproduction of the workforce. I hope you don't mind this little lecture, that probably you're already familiar with the concept, but I think it's important to distinguish because too often now the concept of social reproduction is used in a very general way, and there are important distinctions to be made. What it becomes clear reading Marx, however, is that social reproduction, which he understood as the reproduction of the capitalist system, has been from the beginning a violent system. In other words, that a condition of existence of capitalist society, has been a process, extremely violent process, including slavery, colonization, and the expulsion of the peasantry from its land. And however, according to Marx, this process was to end this need for violence, was to end with the progress of capitalist development. He argued, as you probably all know, that in time, with capitalist development, a generation of workers, it's developed that takes the laws of capitalism as natural laws. In other words, it's just bound to the process of exploitation by economic necessity. They don't have to be killed, expropriated, and violated in different ways in order to accept to work under condition of capitalist exploitation. Marx was very much mistaken. This was one of the major mistakes he made in anticipate the future of capitalist society. Because as we have seen at every phase throughout the history of capitalism, the capitalist class has needed to use the maximum of violence to sustain itself and perpetuate its rule. And never there has been so true as in the present, where we have a capitalist class now, an international capitalist class, that has made of warfare a permanent principle of economic production. As Vandana Shiva has recently stated, we live in an economic system that is really a system of war. I say this, although it may seem obvious, all too obvious, because it's very important to remind ourselves that when we speak of social reproduction today, we are speaking of a battlefield. We are speaking of a process that is extremely violent, and we cannot approach it from a purely analytical viewpoint. We cannot approach it without realizing that, in a way, how we approach it has important political implications. Now, that said, I want to look at the way women have contributed to the struggle, in a way, against the reproduction of capitalism, and in particular concentrate on some of the new forms of struggle that I think are particularly important because they go beyond the perspective that is aimed to ameliorate the condition of women and in a way sow the seeds, as I was saying before, of a new society. As was mentioned before, in the 1970s, I was involved in a movement, the struggle over wages for housework. And the movement really was the concrete manifestation or the realization of a work of discovery that the feminist movement made possible. In that, by struggling against male supremacy, in struggling against the imposition of maternity as a woman's destiny, and the confinement of women to domestic work, the feminist movement really opened the way for the recognition of the home, the family, the so-called private spheres as spheres of production, as in fact spheres of activities that are central to the process of capitalist accumulation. We redefine, in fact, the housework, domestic work, as work that is central to the reproduction daily and generationally of the workforce. So this was an amazing discovery for us, I think truly revolutionary, and not only in a theoretical sense, because in a way it operated a 360-degree change with respect to previous conception of housework, of reproductive labor, which had always been seen in the Marxist socialist tradition as a heritage from a pre-capitalist society, or as a personal service that would be, bypassed with the realization of, communist relations. Instead, what the feminist movement allowed us to realize is that, the activities that are usually understood to be confined to the private sphere are very much public, because they are in fact central to the reproduction of the workforce, and by that, to the reproduction of capitalist relation. And in fact, we describe the family, the home, as a particular type of factory, as traversed by a particular type of assembly line, the assembly line on which labor power, people's capacity to work is daily reproduced. For many of us, this was a window, not only was a path to not only to rethink the position of women in capitalism, and rethink and gain a better understanding of the roots of women's specific forms of exploitation in capitalist society, the roots of women's social subordination. But it was also a path to a new understanding of what capitalism itself is. To realize that this work of reproduction, which is so central to the reproduction of people's lives, as well as to the reproduction of the workforce for the capitalist market, to realize that this work had been marginalized, made invisible, devalued, and basically put in a position not to be remunerated, unpaid, made us understand that first, capitalism is able to accumulate its wealth, through the control, through the extraction of much more unpaid labor than we were all ever made to imagine, from reading Marx, for example. And that, most important, that capitalism requires, it's structurally founded on the devaluation of people's life, on the devaluation of reproductive work, which in fact is the devaluation of people's life. Because by devaluing the work that reproduces life, you also devalue the life itself. And furthermore, we realize that capitalist accumulation is not only the accumulation of wealth, is also the accumulation, the systematic accumulation of differences, hierarchies, and inequalities. In other words, that through the differentiation between paid and unpaid labor, capitalism has been able to, in fact, pacify and control the workforce in a very powerful way. That this division, in fact, have really served to break up the kind of unity that Marx expected to develop with the expansion of capitalism, capitalist relation worldwide. So, as I mentioned before, this opened up a whole new horizon, and a new horizon of struggle as well. Quite briefly, because I've written about this topic, in a variety of places, including this last collection of archival material. The conclusion that we came from this kind of analysis was the necessity of a strategy which we identified as a campaign for wages for housework, the necessity of a strategy that would not only be aimed to improve the condition of women, that would not only be aimed to put an end to the women's social subordination, but at the same time would be capable, to subvert some of the mechanisms that capitalist society has used to reproduce itself. And in that way, we rejected the idea of struggling which was the dominant idea at the time in the feminist movement, of struggling to enter male-dominated areas of work, struggling for equality with men. And we saw this strategy, a strategy that, although might be necessary in terms of immediate survival, they would not have that possibility of creating new relation, of changing the fundamental relation between women and capital, as well as women and men. As we know, this was not the strategy that was adopted by the women's movement by 1976, and even earlier, actually. The women's movement in the United States, and I think also to a great extent in Europe, practically abandoned reproduction as a major terrain of struggle. Much of its energy was concentrated, as I mentioned before, on entering in male-dominated area. A great impulse, to adopting this strategy also came from the intervention of the United Nations in feminist politics by the mid-70s, already by 1975 with the famous conference in Mexico City, which really marked the entrance of the UN, in the field of feminist politics. Because the United Nations very much understood, international capital very much understood, unlike the left, that the feminist movement had a subversive potential. And the rebellion of women against the family, against unpaid labor, against domestic work, and signaled, really a turning point, that in a way, a change had to occur in the organization of reproduction. And this is why, and in addition, and perhaps most important of all, the United Nations also saw that the women's quest for economic autonomy, economic independence of man, could be used to really reactivate a capitalist machine, a capitalist work machine that in the mid-70s was very much in crisis. Very much in crisis because of the combined attack, if you want, by the anti-colonial struggle, by the revolt of industrial workers from Torino to Detroit, by the rise of a student movement that also was fighting against the militarization of life and the war in Vietnam. So by the late 60s, you have a combination of struggle that in fact was placing the reproduction of the system, social reproduction, as the reproduction of capitalist relation in crisis. So the availability of a large pool of women very looking for entrance into male-dominated area, into wage labor, seemed to the United Nations obviously a golden opportunity. And in fact, this is why we have all the discourse of integrating women into development emancipating women through wage labor, etc., etc., etc. We can see now, three decades later, that that was a strategic mistake. Whereas it was necessary for many women to work outside the home and to have access to a wage, to pose entrance into wage labor as a political strategy, as a political horizon, it was a mistake. First of all, it entailed the abandonment of reproduction as a terrain of struggle. As I mentioned, by the mid-70s, practically, except for some struggles around abortion, control of our body, which very soon abortion was, in fact, legalized. The reproduction became a terrain that most feminists abandoned. And this became very clear in '76 when the question of maternity leave in the United States went to the government, went to the Supreme Court. And many families, the majority of the feminist movement did not mobilize to demand federally mandated maternity leave, arguing that if we asked for federally mandated maternity leave, we will lose the right to demand equality with relation to the labor market and to social benefits in general. In other words, maternity leave was seen as a privilege, and it became more and more assumed that in order to actually change our relationship in society, the model, the ideal was to actually reproduce. The model was the male situation, the situation of man in society. It was the model to be reached. And in fact, we saw over time that the extent to which that went. For example, in the late 70s, we had cases of women in West Virginia that literally sterilized themselves to be able to work in the mines. So the kind of masculinization, acceptance of, and renouncement to fight for the very specific needs that are typical of the life of women. For example, needs relating to maternity, needs relating to child raising, and so forth. The decision to place all energies into entrance into male-dominated area was also especially mistaken because the very moment in which women were fighting for this goal, the world economy was undergoing into a major restructuring. We can say a counter-revolution. Now we can see that it was at the beginning of a counter-revolution. What we call globalization was a kind of counter-revolution in terms of being a response to the cycle of struggles that I mentioned before, a response to the anti-colonial struggle, a response to the struggle of industrial workers. So women are entering into wage labor and struggling to enter into male-dominated area at the very moment in which these particular forms of work were in fact undergoing a drastic process of devaluation. At the very moment, for example, in which the industrial setup of the Northeast in the United States was being completely dismantled, jobs were being exported, unions were beginning to negotiate give-backs, and this was really a very critical strategic mistake. So that in fact, over time, women are integrated into wage work, but at the very lowest level. And whereas it is true that for a number of women, did gain access to more rewarding occupation, were able to leave in part the home as the struggle, the feminist movement promised, if we follow this path. Nevertheless, for the majority, the entrance into wage work has by far not kept the promises that were originally attached to it. And quite briefly, because we could spend really a long time describing what are the problems today with women's employment outside the home, but quite briefly, today the majority of women in the United States that are engaged in wage work are not capable by what they earn to really achieve some measure of economic autonomy. Many have to work more than one job, and many cannot make it. In fact, to the end of the month, they are not able, with what they earn, to support themselves. And in fact, we know now that working class women are working for a wage, are the largest number of people indebted in this country, both with regard to healthcare debt, both with regard to mortgage debt, education debt, and everyday debt, the kind of debt that you acquire by using a credit card. There are also the largest number of women who are in debt to payday loan company. Payday loan company, as you know, are companies who give you a loan the day that you get your pay. So in fact, it turns out that many women, as soon as they are paid, they go for a loan. They go for a loan because they're not capable of actually reproducing themselves. So that the crisis, let me add to this, that hand in hand with the dismantling of the industrial structure, we have also seen, with a policy, an international neoliberal policy of disinvestment by the state in the process of social reproduction. Disinvestment that has affected practically every social services, and which by no means is over. I mean, it's a process that continues and has deepened through the years. This investment in subsidies to daycare, to elder care, to health care, and so forth. So here you have a scenario I think is very important to see, to have a strategic understanding, because when we ask ourselves, why, how is it possible that certain political developments are occurring, I think it's very important to understand some of the paths that were taken and some of the mistakes that, in my view, were made. And one of the mistakes that I'm trying to highlight is a kind of strategy that, in a way, started from the principle that only in the paid workplace and only at the so-called point of production you can have some social power as a worker. This was the classical leftist and socialist assumption that only at the so-called point of production you can have some power. An assumption that ran against, for instance, the lesson of the 60s in the United States, right? Which, for instance, showed, how the civil rights movement, how the Black Power movement had been able to mobilize thousands and thousands of people, and had been able to, in a sense, force new relations and put an end to apartheid, starting from the community. I think that the struggle of the 60s, particularly in the Black community, showed the power of the community, showed that you don't confront capitalism or you don't transform social relations only starting from the factory. And what the women's movement was actually demonstrating was that actually from the community, again, from the home, from the family, you could build a new relation. You could actually open up a terrain of struggle to which all kinds of women participate, because the area of reproduction is something that, despite the great diversity that exists among women, despite those great diversity, reproduction is one terrain in which we are stronger. And the principle that, the demands that the strategies that we adopt, that we embraced, should be governed by the realization or the decision that what is best is the best path is the one that can mobilize most of us and can also begin to unify, begin to bring out what is the element of commonality. And I think the struggle over reproduction had the possibility, had that power. One major consequence, negative consequence of the strategies adopted by the women's movement, particularly in abandoning reproduction, was that it failed to support the struggle of welfare women on welfare, who were mobilizing in the 60s and 70s under the slogan that every mother is a working mother, that actually raising children, it's an activity that is beneficial to society, and but we didn't see the mobilization in support of that struggle, and in particular, we didn't see a mobilization against the kind of vilification that already, starting in the 70s, the state began to mount against black women in particular, who were seen as the dominant group, on welfare, which they were not. They were only the most combative. They were not the dominant group. But certainly, the state was capable of mounting a whole process, a whole campaign of vilification that had very long-term consequences, because that process opened up the possibility of then vilifying the black community, as a community that was, in a way, deficient for the lack of role models and for being, in a way, dominated by women who were parasitic on the rest of society. I mean, there's a long, long story. I think that the campaign that began against welfare women had ramifications that had a long-term consequences, including the way the incarceration of many young black men was later justified. So, let me see how much time. No, fortunately, I still have time. So, to summarize this first part of my talk, I would say that we can see today that the strategy that was followed of privileging the so-called point of production, privileging, the wage workplace, has the place that would give us more power, and that would enable us to, in fact, mount an effective struggle, against capitalism, was in fact failed to prove itself, and the consequences of it, I think, are that we and women have not been able to, in a sense, respond to the amazing crisis of reproduction that more and more millions of people have been living. And I say in the United States now, but this could also be extended to Europe, that really went through very similar processes and is still going through similar processes. By crisis of reproduction, I refer to impoverishment, massive impoverishment, collapse, or certainly drop in the life expectancy, increase in the deterioration of health conditions, and the dismal condition in which, for example, children, older people, younger people have been living. And not last on the contrary, first of all, the policy of mass incarceration that has been building all through the last decades and is now continuing and being accompanied by increasing police violence, police brutality against black youth. I think this is all part of a crisis of reproduction where we can see again the violent face of the state. And I believe, I'm not trying to argue that the sole responsibility of this crisis is on the strategic mistakes of the feminist movement. I'm not trying to say that, but I'm arguing that some strategic mistakes have really diminished the possibility of feminism to be a social force, to be a massive social force, capable of bringing women together, capable of undermining the way we had been divided and the way we continue to be divided, the new division that were imposed on us, the new division that has been imposed on us all through the last 4 decades. And it is very important that we reflect on this past history, because I think that there is a new feminist movement that is emerging. It's certainly emerging internationally, but I think it is emerging in the United States as well. And I think it's very important for the new generation of feminists to begin to understand the past in order to have a better strategic conception as to what has to be done. Now, having said that the feminist movement as a whole abandoned reproduction, we have continued to see new forms of struggle emerging in the 80s and further into the 90s. But those struggles have come from outside the women's movement in the US. They've really come in many ways from many cases, women who had come to the US through immigration. For example, by the 80s, in different parts of the country, we have seen the rise of urban farming. We have seen the rise of the urban garden, mostly by the activities of immigrant women coming from the Caribbean island, coming from Latin America, who have been used to have very close relationship to the land and having some control over the food they would produce. We have also seen the rise of a movement of domestic workers, because hand in hand with as you know, with the entrance of women into wage work, we have had the reorganization of reproductive work with its deployment is redistribution on the shoulders of immigrant women. Immigrant women coming from impoverished countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, right? Countries that in the 80s have undergone a massive process of recolonization, because the restructuring of the world economy really begins with the recolonization of the so-called third world. Recolonization by warfare, and above all by economic policy, right? Structural adjustment, the intervention of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the development projects of the World Bank, all of this have activated a process of impoverishment, and that has forced many, many people to leave their country. So we have seen the rise of a domestic workers' movement, and so this is to say that clearly, reproduction is not, there are struggle over reproduction. And the domestic workers' movement, for example, has been able to obtain some benefits on a national level. But at the same time, it has not been supported by the kind of mass mobilization that would really have a transformative effect, right? Now, I want to now turn to some of the forms of struggle that I think have been most inspiring and most important, and say, for instance, that it's not an accident that some struggle that on reproduction that we have seen in the 80s in the United States have been brought to the country by immigrant women. Because by the 1980s and through the last decades, what has been built in places like Latin America, parts of Africa, has been a whole new movement of women that is now in the front line in the defense of land, territory, urban spaces, precisely against the advance of capitalist relation. As I mentioned before, all through the 80s, we have seen a brutal process of recolonization. By the way, let's talk about recolonization, instead of post-colonialism. There's nothing post-colonial. Now, neither in Africa or Latin America or the Caribbean, there is nothing which is post-colonial. We are really back to colonialism, except that you don't have, the British flag or the American flag, on African or Latin American country. But everything else, it's really a return to the colonial system, except that the ruling class of Latin America, it's very, or Africa, is very much in agreement with the system to some extent. That's a whole discussion, by the way. Yes. But, so, what does it mean? It means that we have seen through the imposition of brutal austerity program and through the attack on indigenous people's land. This, for instance, was one of the goals of the war that the United States assisted in Guatemala in the early 80s that led to the death of 250,000 people, right? It was presented as a war against an armed leftist insurrection. In reality, it was an attack that was waged against indigenous people's land. And more recently, the politics of extractivism, which means that practically in every part of Latin America and Africa, it's the same. You have now mining company, you know, or energy company, petroleum companies, or also companies setting up hydroelectric plants and aeolic parks. So, for instance, I was just recently in Oaxaca state, and the whole state of Oaxaca has been concession, and the south of Mexico has been concession to foreign companies. Now, women are really today in the forefront of the struggle. And there is an important reason why they have been in the forefront of the struggle to defend the land, to defend their territory, which is that they understand better than any other member of their community. They understand that once communitarian regimes are destroyed, once the land is lost, once the great corporation, the Monsanto or Cargill are controlling the land, that once the mining company or the petroleum companies have a free hand in drilling, excavating, squeezing the earth, contaminating and poisoning the seas and the fields, once all of that has been achieved, people are dead. The cultures are dead. The communities are dead. Women say, in the Norte, they call it development. We call it violence. We call it violence. And so there are movements that are growing. There are movements now in Latin America that are growing, that are very much inspired by the movement of indigenous people, and who understand, for instance, that you cannot separate, you know, the struggle against patriarchal relations for the improvement of the condition of women, you know, from the struggle over the environment, from the struggle for the land, the struggle for the territory, you know, territory understood as a place for collective action. Struggle as a place understood as a place, you know, where a collectivity can live. And once the waters are contaminated, not only the possibility of cultivation is gone, right? But the possibility of survival, that the loss of the land is the loss of the culture, is the loss of the languages, is the loss, basically, it's a condemnation to death. And I think that's one of the reasons why in recent years we have seen so much violence against women, and it continues. You know, the death of Berta Cáceres is now well known in the United States, but is one among many. And also, what has been very, very important in the struggle the women are making, especially in Latin America, is that those struggles that often begins in the rural area, they begins in the field, have also moved and are moving into the city, into the urban area, in the sense that those who have been expelled from the land, you know, are now resettling in the city and recreating communitarian relationship in the city. And in the process, they are creating new forms of social reproduction, new forms of reproduction of life that in a way are more cooperative, more collective, really built on the principle of what I've called the commons, on the principle of the commons. That communitarism that has been so prevalent, both in Africa and as well as in Latin America, you know, is now also restructuring, you know, large sectors of urban life and creating new forms of social reproduction that I think have a very important inspirational power. And we have seen the growth of those forms of reproduction over the years in response, as I said before, to expulsion from the land, and as well as forms of brutal impoverishment and political repression. You know? In Chile, already in the 70s, early 70s in Chile, in response to the Pinochet golpe, women went to the street and they set up popular kitchen, began to shop together, in the understanding that this would enable them to survive economically, but also the coming together who give them some strength at a time in which everybody was paralyzed by terror. And where often when men met more than two at a time, they'll be disappeared and killed. This happened again in Argentina in 2000 when women, for instance, when the monetary economy collapsed, and women again, the piquetera, came together and began to transfer their reproductive activities into the streets and also organize life for months through different forms of exchange and through popular assemblies, regaining not only some control over reproduction, but also about decision-making. And today, this communitarian reorganization of the community has extended and is one of the main terrain of struggle that I think is most inspirational because in a way, it guarantees not only the possibility of survival to population for whom capital and the state have nothing to give, but it also guarantees the building of a resistance. I think what these new practices are demonstrating is how crucial reproduction, the terrain of reproduction, is not only to survival, right, but also to the possibility of struggle. In other words, the reproduction is central in the sense that its organization, right, is also necessary. And its organization in a more collective way, more cooperative way, is also necessary to create a stronger infrastructure for struggle. Over the last years, for instance, women from the Amazonia have walked, thousands and thousands have walked to Quito to tell Korea, the then president, that they don't want people to come to the Amazonia and drill their territory, their fields and their lands. And how do you organize a march for weeks and weeks with children and thousands of people? You organize them because you have a cooperative already conception of how life is reproduced. So we find that there are really very inspirational practices taking place, and also the way in which new feminist movement, what many women call popular feminism in Latin America, is also being very much inspired, by the struggles of indigenous people. And they are taking from those struggles something that is very, very important. For instance, the importance of work together in the day-to-day process of reproduction, the importance of cooperating. In many indigenous communities in Latin America, you cannot even talk into an assembly unless you do the reproductive work. Right? Reproductive work is really, cooperative reproductive work is really a must, so much so that you don't getting the right to talk in the assembly unless you do that kind of work. And also the importance of moments of resignification. For example, the fiesta in many indigenous communities is a moment of resignification of the identity. It's not just having fun, but it's a moment in which the identity and the commitment are being resignified. And also the importance of memory, of maintaining, preserving, reconstructing the collective memory. Memory, as a feminist writer, Mina Lorena Navarro, has written, as a dispositive of resistance, right? Memory is a dispositive of resistance and of solidarity. In other words, remembering, right, what happened, bringing out the knowledge of what happened in the land, what happened in the territory, who died there, who spilled the blood. Women in many indigenous communities sewed the placenta into the land to instill the notion of the connection with the land. Connection with the land is connection with all the rhythm and cycles of life. So that sense of memory, the importance of memory as a dispositive of resistance, it's also a factor in the building of solidarity and courage in front of a repression that is extremely brutal and relentless. It's a solidarity that, in fact, makes it possible for people to deal with the constant attack against the community, the constant assassination and disappearance of people, because as it was often pointed out in meetings that I've been, when we have solidarity not only with the living but also with the dead, what enables us to survive and to keep struggling even in the front, in the face of so much brutality and so much pain and so much fear, is that when somebody dies, everybody comes together, everybody participates to make sure that that person is not forgotten, to make sure that that person keeps living in the community. And to conclude, because I think my time is definitely past, is I mention these struggles because it seems to me that today we are in such a state of emergency that we cannot think in any respect of struggles that are simply directed to make some improvement in our life, but we also have to think of struggle that have that potential of change, of creating new relation, of transforming, of affirming a principle different from the principle that governs the life in capitalist society, which now for 500 years has demonstrating to be completely unsustainable. Thank you.
My name is Alona, and the question, it's not to you, but maybe you thought about it. Every time listening or reading about feminist history, I feel there is a huge block missing from it. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or it's done on purpose. I mean the Soviet emancipatory project. And I think, this project of women emancipation needs to be either criticized or maybe we could take something from it, but it could not be ignored. But I think it's often ignored. And that's basically the question. Have you ever thought why? And maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's not ignored, but being from that part of the world and seeing feminists who are connecting what they're doing, their struggle, to what women were doing in Europe or US, but not to their grandmothers, for me it seems quite strange. Yeah.
No. Can you clarify the question? I think it's not understood.
So the Soviet project of female emancipation.
The which project? The
Soviet.
Soviet
sorry.
project.
Sorry for my accent.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Do you think
Soviet feminist or Soviet project of emancipation, and it's
Do you think it's ignored, and if it is, why?
No problem. Okay, and then one last question here, and we'll turn it back to Sylvia to respond. Well, I think we'll have time for another round as well.
Thank you for the talk. It's a Vikramaditya Chaudhary from India. My question is that do you not think that the whole feminist project as of today, when we are talking, it's a 2018, has also largely been appropriated, at least to some extent, especially in the third one and in the regimes which are dominated by the rising right-wing states, by the imperialist forces. Within the name of the freedom to different, like I cite you one of the recent judgment in India in the name of what instant triple talaq. What they have done is that criminalize the kind of that different kind of a marriage laws in the part of the world. So what I'm actually asking that do you think that the imperialist forces have appropriated feminist movement to some extent in different parts of the world?
Okay, so go ahead.
Very briefly, yeah, sex workers, right? You know, I think that sex workers have been under attack for a long, long time. And so my response to that actually is not direct, is indirect. Because I think that one of the problems I think that we're facing in the feminist movement or among feminists, because today is the division on the question of sex work. And I think it's a division that is very, very negative, has very negative consequences. It's a division that has been taking place for a long time. And, you know, I come from a kind of feminism that takes as a principle that we are not going to tell women what kind of exploitation they have to choose. But we are going, that the task of our struggle is to create conditions so that women have more and more possibility to escape all forms of exploitation. And that would be my response. So I would, which is not to deny, for instance, that there are forms of sex work, or there are forms of prostitution that are coerced, and those should be fought against. But you know, the idea, for instance, that some feminists are embracing that prostitution is particularly degrading. It's a particularly degrading activity. It seems to me, I reject it completely. I think it's far more degrading to sell your brain than to, in a sense, yeah, and I think in academia, I think we have plenty to look at before we talk about sex work. And about, you are right, you know, you're absolutely right that we don't have, you know, to the speaker in the back there, yes. So yes, we need to know more. And it's true, for instance, in my case, more and more I've been attracted and moving towards Latin America because there's so much relationship that we have now with people in Latin America. But yes, you're absolutely right. We need to learn more about the struggle that women are making in the former Soviet Union. And the appropriation by the state, right. And I think it says something about the feminist movement, because I think the state is trying to appropriate, as the United Nations. I mean, I call the United Nations the international state, right? This is a process of appropriation that has been going on since at least the mid-70s. And I think capitalism has discovered that women are the ideal workers. They are the ideal worker, and they can be used both in production and in reproduction. And in fact, today we are already in a kind of a trans workforce because women have to be men and women at the same time. You know, we have to move from one polarity to the other in all kinds of situations. And so this has been the emancipation that the United Nations has offered to us. Right? This is really the emancipation. So I think and I hope that now the kind of enthusiasm that many feminists had in the late 70s and 80s about working with the United Nations and going to Beijing to get the last words, or because this would be like a very important place to have our words heard, you know, where the powerful gathered. That I hope that enthusiasm today has diminished, and the capacity of appropriation is diminishing internationally. I would hope so. You know, there was a time, and this I'm very happy to say this, there was a time when I criticized feminists for instance, going to Beijing or going to Nairobi, et cetera, they would say, oh, but listen, there we get to know the life and we get to contact women from other countries, we get to know about the situation very well. I used to say, look, the Zapatistas are getting people up in the mountain of Chiapas. They're getting people from all over the world, right, with rice and beans, but they're able to actually have intergalactic encounters. And more recently, on March 8th, 10,000 women, right, went to Chiapas, went to actually Morelia, one of the caracoles, right? So we don't need the United Nations to bring us together. Yeah.
I think we actually have time for 2 more rounds of 3, so let's do round 2. There's one there.
We have 20 minutes.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, lots of time.
I'm over here. Thank you so much for your amazing talk. And the question I have is that we're seeing a global rise of kind of colonial nostalgia that's going hand in hand with the global rise of kind of exploitative capitalism, right, through globalization, as well as through all kinds of other donor-led policies in the so-called third world. But we're seeing a lot of kind of colonial nostalgia, as well as racism on the rise in both policy discourse as well as in academia. So what would you say, how should we kind of energize the new young feminist movement in thinking about the connections between colonial exploitation and capitalist exploitation, because so much of the feminist movement tends to focus on what is come to be known as white feminism, right? It's about the paid work, labor, not about intersectionality, about what's happening to women of color. So, but I would like us to think about, you know, it's not just about anti-capitalism, but it's also an anti-colonial project, and that kind of narrative has not been filtered down. So if you had thoughts about how to energize more people.
Great. Okay, another question. There's someone standing up in the back, and then another person with a beard, so maybe the two of you. There's only one person with a beard, yeah, right. But the one with the glasses.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Simone Tolmello, University of Lisbon. Well, I was thinking about future a bit. And, recently I've read something by Bifo Berardi about. And so I was thinking about technology. What's the role of technology and futures in technology? I mean, if automation actually reduces the need for reproduction, what does means for the importance of reproduction as a place of struggle? Or on the other hand, is it possible that technology and whatever can bring some kind of new general intellect with disruptive potential? I don't believe so, but I would like to hear.
Hi, I work with something called the Bob Avakian Institute, and he's the architect of a new communism, and breaking with and going beyond some of the mechanical materialism and teleology of Marxism. And one of the questions he's looked at is the question of the oppression and liberation of women, the oppression as a independent dynamic, but also integrated into capitalism and imperialism. And he argues it's both a driving force for an actual revolution, in the U.S. and around the world, and also part of the liberation of women and the struggle over that question, including traditional gender roles, is a part of the process of actually driving the socialist transition to communism forward. As the people who say, no, we're not done yet. We're not stopping until all the chains are broken. So I wanted to put the question of how do you see the relationship between the struggle against the oppression of women, but not just for movements or social movements, or we can be inspired by Chiapas, but they don't have state power. It's not a liberated. It's not gone beyond a small area. And so, how do you see the question of actual revolution, the actual breaking of all traditions and oppressive chains, with that as one of the most burning and driving, crying out urgent needs for revolution?
Yes, I mean, these are all like big questions, and so I can only answer. I mean, how do you, because, colonialism is not only outside, it's in the United States, right? I mean, we have slavery, and so the question of, I talked about the question of the lack of support for welfare women. I think this was really a terrible mistake. And to me, today the hope is that has, particularly through the presence of immigrant communities, and I'm speaking now specifically about the United States, but that could be expanded to Europe, the presence of immigrant communities in the United States, there is the growth of a better understanding, at least in large sectors of the population, of a better understanding of what has been the relationship of the United States, right? Not only in terms of the colonial past of Europe and so on, but the ongoing relationship of the United States to the continuing forms of colonization in the world, the new forms of colonization and imperialism that today are not taken exactly the same, but are as brutal, as violent, and as destructive as those of the past. And so this is my hope. This is my hope that as the right wing is using immigration to divide people and to build these walls and et cetera, on the other hand, in fact, I gained some courage from the spread of the sanctuary movement that is growing in a number of cities, and hopefully, and seeing more of some growing support, for the dreamers, etc. I hope that experience, it's also creating a new vision, a new perspective, among feminists as well, but definitely much needed. Technology and reproduction. Well, no, I'm not. Of course, I'm not against technology. I'm against capitalist technology, because capitalist technology has always been invented to destroy forms of people's, workers' organization, to disempower people. So capitalist technology is not a neutral tool, right? And I do not share the view of Italian Marxist autonomists who believe that we are now in the phase of cognitive labor, and capitalism does not need living labor any longer. Just to say that even according to statistics, the work of reproduction, particularly, considering childcare, represents the largest sector of work in society. The largest sector of work, reproductive work in the old sense of reproduction, direct reproduction of human life. That cannot, or hopefully will not, be technologized. I know that in Japan, they are building nurse bots, love bots, and all kinds of robots that you can make love to and that can help the elderly to take a bath. beside the fact that they are extremely expensive, but I don't think that we want robots to care for our children. You know, if that's where humanity is going, I think it's really a sad, sad future, right? So I would say two things. One is that the idea, the assumption that capitalism does not need living labor, it's very blind, because it shows that they never look at the side of reproduction. Because if you looked at the question of reproduction, like typical of Marx, you know, in the German ideology, it says, well, in the morning, with the development of technology, et cetera, so in the morning, we can go to fishing, in the evening, we can read poetry. Where do you put childcare? Marx never talked about childcare, for instance, right? And I don't think the most Marxists today talk about childcare. Yes. Yeah? Children are absent. So are older people, so are sick. The whole question of older people not self-sufficient, etc. Well, I don't look for the future where we are going to be taken care of by little robots running around our houses and yeah. So I think we have to think of other forms of technology. And I think also we have seen reproductive technology, which has been really instrumental to new forms of enslavement, right? Like, for example, surrogate motherhood, which I really object to because it's different. I think surrogate motherhood, I don't blame women if by necessity they are forced to do that. But certainly it's really merchandising children. It's certainly the sale of children. About the question of revolution, I belong to a generation that grew up with revolution, and for a long time we thought, it's around the corner. Well, I've given up that idea. Not because I don't think that we need it. Of course, we'll need a revolution, hopefully a good one. Not a bad one, because we have seen a few bad ones too. But I think that my concern now is, you don't defeat capitalism. You don't defeat capitalism over a short period of time. The struggle to create a new society, in my view, and I think it's a long, long struggle, because so much of capitalism has been internalized. Right? So much of capitalism, I think we have gone through such a process also of impoverishment, internal impoverishment, not only material impoverishment, right? But also internal impoverishment in terms of creativity, in terms of capacity to understand, in terms of our relationship to other people. I think that one of the struggles today, and this is why I've been very interested in the concept of the commons, and building new communitarian relations, has been the idea that we need a process of reconstituting the social fabric of society, that we have suffered not only because of the unemployment, for instance, coming from the dismantling of industrial setups, but also from the disintegration of entire communities. And the kind of individualism also that has grown, that is rampant, the brutalization of life, the militarization of life, all of this, I think we do not overcome those wounds over a short time. So I see the process now as really rebuild the condition that will make a revolution possible, a revolution to a society, built on the principle of solidarity, built on the principle of the sharing of the wealth, of the sharing of the earth, and not on the principle of competition and private property. So I think it's a must be a very longer process.
Okay, so we have time for 2 more questions. Okay, so there's one here and one there. And then the other woman, yeah.
So you talked a lot about, I guess my question is about like following what you were just talking about sites of struggle, and that I know we actually kind of snuck in, we're not part of the conference, but we're like involved in like local struggles a lot, and you know, have a lot of admiration for the Zapatistas or the Kurds or whatever, and that's great. Or even like struggles like Standing Rock and all that, but yeah. And I think in terms of like addressing this sort of like internalized capitalism that is so strong in particular in the US, and the need for commons and recommoning ourselves, I guess I'm wondering, like, I've thought a lot about like what is the site of struggle that's possible and most potent in, not just in the US, but like for people who are landed in a particular place in the US, from where you are as like just whoever the hell you are, like not as an activist per se, or an academic, or a, you know, somebody in this position of thinking about, oh, I am gonna think about what is the most important struggle, but like from an embodied perspective. And I've wondered, like, is the welfare rights movement, is that still a potent, you know, we're looking backwards now, like, okay, the Black Panthers did all this great stuff. They also had a lot of failings, but there's a lot of things they did right. The welfare rights, the feminist movement. So I'm wondering, like, if there's things you've seen in particular. I'm asking particularly in the U.S. I mean, I know here we have like a local struggle for
Just
the
'cause of time,
yeah.
yeah.
That's it. Anyway, that's it.
Somebody else can also talk.
Yeah. The woman right there is.
Thank you very much for a very empowering talk. I feel very heartened by just listening to you. What I take from your present talk is that you're telling us that we should get the power back in terms of reproduction. And I'm heartened by that. But at the same time, you see, I would like, from a very practical point of view, what is the role of men in this? Because I'm concerned in the academia, we are fine. But outside that, I come from Sri Lanka and from South Asia, it is just like it is not easy for the feminist movement to take off at all. There are 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. And I would like to know, how do you get the men into it?
Okay, another one.
No, that's it. I think we don't have time for more, so we'll take these 2.
Okay, very briefly. How do I see in the U.S., right? I know I think there are many, you mentioned Standing Rock, for instance. I think that Standing Rock was really very, very important, and not only because of the struggle of indigenous people. Indigenous people have made many struggles in this country. I think, well, I don't know, I hope I'm right, but I think that what was so impressive, I think, about Standing Rock was how very in a short time it became a process of gathering, and it built a support from a lot of people from different parts of the country. That at its peak it built to 7,000 people, and probably may have continued to build if people had not been, in a sense, disinformed and sent home, right? So it seems to me, for example, the Standing Rock, you know, has shown something new that I think in relation to indigenous people's struggle, that there is much more of a support for the struggle and a coming together of different movements with indigenous people's struggle than there's been in the past. So, and also, of course, the power of women, right? Because the women who call themselves the water protectors, they were the one who organized amazing schools and, you know, reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. So the Occupy movement, I think also the Occupy movement. I'm not so negative as many people have been on the Occupy movement. I think it demonstrated a really desire for communal relations. For many young people, I think it was a moment of really expansion of consciousness and really growth. And I don't think that all that is gone. I don't think that movement is gone. It might actually take different forms. And there are, in the United States now, there are also many common building activities. I was very heartened, for example, to learn that time banks, which I thought were just radical actually are quite widespread, for instance. And I read a report that many people are now using time bank, particularly women, and they like it not only because they get certain services for free, but because they're building a community, right? They're building a community. So I think that the desire to break out of isolation, it's there. And the desire to regain control, as you said, over the process of reproduction, regain control of our life, it's beginning to happen. In any case, I see that desire to break the isolation, to build more communitarian relations, as what is more promising, as a condition for every other struggle, for instance, has a condition for every other struggle. Because without strong relation among people, you cannot really confront the system. You cannot really confront the system. Not only, as I said, not only more cooperation in reproduction is a better guarantee of survival, but is also a strength in the struggle. And about men, my view is that, I think women should not spend energy and time trying to educate men the way black people have refused always to spend energy and time to educate whites. I think you educate men by organizing your autonomy, by organizing your work, and then that is the best possibility for them to learn. I think it was when women left the male-dominated organization that some men began to learn and see, gain an understanding, for example, of what had been women's work in those organizations. Many organizations folded because women had done all the infrastructural work. That's been crucial. Women have been to the reproduction struggle. And I think that's the best way to proceed. Although I wonder what you said, in academia all is fine. Is that true? That's not what I hear. That's not what I hear in this country. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.